Okay, so most of the time so far we've been looking at how you divide an object into a fraction. So if you had a circle and you say you want it in 4 pieces, you divide it into 4 pieces and you might have 1/4. Now we're going to look at what happens if you're dividing objects into fractions. Okay, so how would we do this? That would be if you had a scenario, like if you had a situation where maybe you had two people and their names were Lorelei and Jerome. Okay, and they were trying to share some cookies. And there were 3 cookies down the bottom, 1, 2, and 3. And we had to look at how we could use fractions to make sure they could share all of these 3 cookies between them both. So the first thing you look at is how many would they need. If there's 3 cookies, how many could they each have that are whole? So a whole cookie. How many whole cookies could they get? Let's have a look. So if Lorelei had 1 cookie, then we could put Lorelei's on one of them and Jerome's name on one of them. So each of them both have 1 cookie each. And then you're left with 1 cookie over here. So you think, what do you need to do with this last cookie to make sure that you can divide it up? Well, Lorelei got 1 and Jerome got 1. So over here we have 1 cookie. How do we share this between 2 people? We could divide it in half. And we could have Lorelei would have 1 and Jerome could have 1. So you can see here that Lorelei has 1.5 and Jerome has 1.5, and they both have an equal amount. And this is where it gets tricky because this is how you have to draw it. When you're drawing a whole, you draw your whole as a bigger number, and then your fraction, okay, is a bit smaller. So you have to have 1 whole, and then you have to have 1/2. So you can see here the 1 takes up that whole part, and the fraction only takes up half each. So 1/2. We don't do this, okay? We make sure our whole number is a lot bigger. It's twice the size as what each of those numbers is. So Jerome has 1.5 and Lorelei has 1.5. Let's try another one and see how we go. This time we're going to have a few more people. We're going to have Alina, we're going to have Jackson, and we might have Rose. Okay, and they went and they were deciding that they were going to try and share apples together. So they got their apples and they got all their apples out, and there was 1 apple, 2 apples, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Bit confusing so far, isn't it? Well, let's have a look. How could you share 7 apples between these 3 people? Now remember, the first thing we need to do is make sure so we can say how many whole apples they could have first. And then we can divide the last one at the end. So let's see how many whole apples they could have. So Alina would have 1. Then Jackson would have 1. Then Rose would have 1. Then Alina would have 1. And then Jackson would have 1. And then Rose would have 1. Could Alina have this one? No, because there's not enough there for Jackson and for Rose. So let's have a look how many they had each. Alina has 2, Jackson has 2, and Rose has 2. So when we're at 2 whole apples, they all have. Okay, how could I then make this last shape? How could I then make sure that they all get part of this last one? Well, I could divide it into thirds, couldn't I? So obviously it's harder to cut up an apple, but I might divide it into, let me think about this, into thirds, into 3 pieces, and I put Alina's name on 1, I put Jackson's name on 1, and I put Rose's name on 1. Okay, so now I'm looking at Alina and I'm thinking, how much of this one does she have? Now I find the denominator, which is 1, 2, 3 pieces. And how many does Alina have? Alina has 1. So that's the numerator is 1, so she has 1/3. So she already had 2, and she has now another third. So what do? I take her 2 over here, and then I add on her third, 1/3. So how many does she have? She has 2 and 1/3. How many does Jackson have? He has 2 and 1/3. And how many does Rose have? 2 and 1/3. So you can see clearly it's easier to share the whole numbers first and then to divide the last number at the end. We'll try one more before we go. Let's use 2 more people. Let's use Charlize and we will use Jessica. Okay. And we might use Rosa as well. Okay. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 oranges. How could we share these 5 oranges between these 3 girls? How could we do it using fractions? Well, let's say the first thing we need to do is make sure we see how many whole numbers they get each. Okay, so Rosa would have 1 orange, Charlize would have an orange, and then Jessica would have an orange. Can I go there and make Rose get 1 and Charlize get another orange? No, I can't, because then Jessica wouldn't have another orange, and they would both have too much. We need to make sure it's even. So how could I've got 2 oranges left, but I've got 3 people. It's a bit trickier, isn't it, this time? Because I can't then divide it into 4 pieces and 4 pieces, because that would make sense. So how can I do it? Well, this is actually a really tricky one, and I don't expect you to be able to get this by yourself, but I want you to try to understand why I've done this. Okay? I'm going to take this orange, and I'm going to divide it into 3 pieces. And then take this orange, and I'm going to divide it into 3 pieces. And then I'm going to put Rose's name here, Charlize's name here, and Jess's name here, and do the same thing here. So you can see here that this orange has been split into 3 pieces, and this orange has been split into 3 pieces. So how do I then figure out how to write this down as a fraction? Now this is quite tricky. So we go 1, 2, Rosie gets 1, Charlize gets 1, Jess gets 1. So they all have 1 whole. Now remember, that's how you need to say it. If they get a whole orange, then you say they have 1 whole. Okay, they have 1 whole. And then how many of these other ones do they have? Well, they have 1/3, and here they have 1/3. How do I plus these together? Let's have a think about it. How do I plus them together? Well, it's pretty easy actually. You just think to yourself, well, if I was to plus this third and put it over here, like that, move that third and move it over here, then how many would I have? I would have 2 pieces over 3. So it would be 2/3. So Rosa has 2/3, Charlize has 2/3, and Jess has 2/3. Now just to explain that again, what I did was I cut it into 3, and cut this into 3. Okay, and then I wrote their names on them. And how do I plus them together? Well, basically, you could just do this. You could go Rose, Rose, Charlize, Charlize, Jess, Jess. Even if I just do it differently, you can see now, then how much does Rose have? Rose has 2 now over 3. So there's 3 pieces. The denominator is 3. And Rose has 1, 2. So she has 2/3. So each of them get 1 and 2/3. Now, I know this is a bit tricky, this one, but I think that it will actually... A lot of you will enjoy doing these sort of questions because they test your brain a bit more and make you work a bit harder, and they're quite enjoyable to do. So hopefully you find these interesting and exciting, and if you have any problems with them, please let me know. Thanks.